Well, the Political View is our weekly feature where we look at the major political stories dominating the headlines, and of course the biggest show in town today was certainly the State Capture Commission chaired by Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo. For the first time, former President Jacob Zuma is expected to give proper answers about his involvement in the long-running saga we know as state capture. But that may be some time away as proceedings began today. Well, we're joined in the studio by senior political reporter at the Sunday Times and Diso Blackstar, Qaanitah Hunter. Good evening to you and thank you for your time. I mean, it's taken some time to get here, but finally the commission is underway.
Absolutely. We heard from the Deputy Chief Justice sort of, painting the picture of how we got here and how this commission began. We know that the proclamation was signed only in January this year, and there was a lot of work that obviously had to take place from then up until now, where tomorrow the first witness will come forward in this commission of inquiry. The Deputy Chief Justice made some very important points to say that, government has been asked to help them, but at some point, some officials have been really sort of tardy in assisting the commission, and that's why they have stalled for so long. And particularly calling out... Any foul
play we can read in that?
The last time we asked Justice Zondo about this, he said, he thinks it's just inefficiency. And he says that they've been waiting for clearances, security clearance from the state security agency. This was the matter he raised a month ago. Today, he raised the same issue, and then very quickly, the proceedings then began.
Of course, nothing explosive in terms of revelations. I think given the drama in terms of what's already in the public domain, there are people who will expect every day to be exciting, but it's going to be meticulous, there's going to be a lot of detail, and importantly, it may take some time.
Absolutely. Justice Zondo saying previously that he wants to be thorough in this process. So when Advocate Paul Pretorius, took the stand and he's heading the legal process, he sort of went through of what they're expecting from this hearing, how the process that's going to be taking place. There's different lawyers, heading different streams. For example, the lawyer that's heading the, investigations into the South African Airways is not the same lawyer that would be heading investigations or the process in, Eskom. So it's very technical, and the process is going to be absolutely thorough. And the other aspect is that we've heard from some of the implicated people, and that was quite interesting, Bokani, because lawyers, senior counsel, some very senior members of the bar coming forward and saying they represent so-and-so and so-and-so. We know that Advocate Mike Helens is acting on behalf of Ajay Gupta. We know Muzi Zikhankani is acting on behalf of former President Jacob Zuma. Fana Hlongwane had a lawyer present. There was also, interestingly, the former Public Enterprises Minister Lynn Brown sent a lawyer, even though she did not hear anything from the commission and she was not told that she was implicated. So I think people want to preempt some of the witness statements that are going to come forward because it's going to be damning.
Now, we obviously know who the headline grabbers are going to be. Fakey Mentor is expected to give her testimony, I think, next week on this day. But also I think it's going to be crucial for the civil servants, the people who signed the documents, who've got the evidence, so that it's not just, he said, she said.
Absolutely. So the first witness to be called tomorrow is obviously Ndeleni Willie Mathubela, who is Mathubela rather. He is 15 years at Treasury. He is the acting chief procurement officer. Now, there's a lot that has been said about him. He's appeared in Parliament before, and he's really been criticised by MPs in Parliament. So it will be interesting to see what he presents and what he brings forth. And we got an impression from the Commission today that they would really want to get some process from him. So what are the norms? What are the standards? How does procurement happen between the state and state-owned entities and government?
What should have happened and what didn't?
Absolutely. And then, you like you said, your fakey mentors, we know that she, alleged that the Gupta has offered her a position of Public Enterprises Minister, and President Zuma was aware of that. Now, that statement has been forwarded to the former president to respond. The like of Themba Maseko, who's the former head of government government communication and information system. He alleged that the former president directly told him in a telephone conversation to help the Guptas. And then there's obviously the Mcebisi Jonas matter. Now, what the commission, said before, and today it was expanded on, is that this evidence that they received in forms of affidavits have been forwarded to implicated officials and implicated parties, and they have 14 days to respond. Now, the one issue, the technicality that was raised today, which is actually quite important for later on in the commission, is that, for example, Jacob Zuma's lawyer stood up and said they were only given a document late on Friday that's very important for them to respond to, and they say they need time. So while the lawyers were sort of playing this game of they don't want to interfere and they don't want to hamper the work of the commission, they kind of giving a warning to the commission that they really want them to stick by the book and give them the ample time they need to respond to these damning accusations.
Of course, the cynic might say that the former president's lawyer saying they don't want to delay the commission and yet promptly asking for more time, maybe part of the stalling tactics we've seen before. An issue, of course, that's been raised is the issue of costs. We know that these commissions tend to drag on for some time, and already the price tag for this one is sitting at nearly R250 million just for 6 months.
And that 6 months actually expired. Now, if you look, that's from March. So March, April, May, June, July, August. So that money of R250 million is already gone. And now they would have to go to Treasury to secure more funds for this commission. It's going to be very expensive now when there's lawyers involved. There's a whole team of investigators that need to be paid. That's besides the operating cost of this commission. And so, and the other aspect, which is something that a lot of people raised today, was that some of these implicated officials, some of these state-owned entities and incumbent ministers are maybe using taxpayers' money to fund their lawyers to defend them here at this commission. And that's something that we really, really need to look at very closely. I mean, today we've just heard from, the likes of Ajay Gupta, etc., etc. But going forward, there would be incumbent ministers, there would be officials and politicians that may rely on funding from the state to be represented in this commission.
But just take us through, some of the broader strokes of what this inquiry then is going to look at. We know there have been a number of parliamentary processes, for example. There's this enormous body of evidence that's already been established. How are they going to look at all of those issues in terms of what's already on the record through a number of the other processes that have looked at issues that they might want to delve into?
So Advocate Tanya Norman really painted that picture today, using the Public Protector's report obviously as the bedrock, because it's based on her recommendations that this inquiry was set up. And then looking at other investigations. Treasury reports are obviously a very, very important part of this investigation, because it obviously went to the heart of things and also very technical in nature. But they're also going to consider things like, the unburdening reports from the South African Council of Churches, all of these documents that are already in the public domain. But they have asked for the public to come forward with more information. And Justice Zondo has repeatedly said that he is not satisfied at the public's response. He says, what about people in municipalities? Why aren't you coming forward? There has to be some sort of trail of evidence in municipalities and provincial governments. And so there is this call for people to come forward with more information that's not already out in the public domain. For now, it's to obviously corroborate and to present sort of both sides of the versions of events and the accusations. And I give you an example, Bongani. Take, for example, Themba Maseko. He got a phone call from the former president, or he's alleged to have had a phone call from the former president, and then he had subsequent calls and meetings with Ajay Gupta. Now, this commission and the investigators would be at pains now to corroborate it, to look for other information.
Travel logs, vehicle tracking logs, phone call records, that sort of thing.
And the former public protector, Thuli Madonsela, tried to do that, but obviously she was restricted with resources. And so now this commission will then go and say, okay, who did you tell about it? And then he would say, I told Frank Chikane, for example, like the Sunday Times reported. And then they would go to that person and say, did so-and-so confirm to you that this was the incident that happened? So this is basically, one tiny brick of a really, really massive building of state capture, and they really have their work cut out for them.
I suspect for the next few months you and I are going to be discussing the state capture matter quite often, but it's not the only story you want to talk about. Let's now go to the Northwest. We saw yesterday at that ANC meeting, Supra Mahumapelo, the former premier, being booed. Now, is that a matter of which faction might have been more dominant at that meeting on that particular day?
It's an interesting thing because there's been a serious push since his removal as premier for the ANC's provincial leadership to be disbanded. And that conversation the ANC has been sort of pushing aside to say that, they need to unite the organization. But you've seen reports over the weekend about evidence coming forward. The Cabinet's own interministerial task team that was set up made damning findings about the situation that they found in the Northwest. For example, the allegation that the former premier asked every government department for 10 million rand to assist, and there was no real accounting of that money in his service delivery plan. And so there's these real elephants in the room with regards to Supra Mahumapelo, the former premier, but now he's still in charge as the ANC chairperson. But obviously there's a lot of regional factionalism that's at play. And let's not forget that there's a list conference that's taking place, meaning people are fighting and jostling and getting ready to be on the ANC's list before the election so that they can stand as party representatives. And I think that's really going to be the test for the ANC in that province.
All right, so he may be gone in terms of being in charge of the province, but certainly within the party he remains a force to be reckoned with. But the other disturbing thing to emerge out of the Northwest is the number of municipalities that are barely functioning. A number of them caught, of course, in that VBS Mutual Bank snare.
Absolutely. And, it's a conglomeration of many things. And, one being, just inefficiency. But there's also a serious issue of corruption and then, political interference from on a provincial level in these municipalities that this interministerial report obviously, sort of focused on. But Bongani, I think that the VBS issue is going to be a litmus test of how the ANC responds to really
and the political will really to fight these things. Absolutely,
because it's it's an issue of failed leadership. It's an issue of they were warned not to deposit funds into VBS, and yet they've done it. And I mean that's a huge scandal that's countrywide perhaps. But in the Northwest, these municipalities are ailing already. They're failing to just exist as municipalities,
right.
And a lot needs to happen.
Now the other story, of course, is Ayanda Dlodlo doing what might be called an about turn on those jobs in the public sector. 30,000 was the number that was touted. She's now saying that, well, actually we do need to consider letting younger people get jobs and phasing out older folks within the public service. What do you make of that?
In her defense, she says that there was no number of 30,000. She says there's only a figure of 30.2 billion rand that of the wage bill that government has to claw back. That's the excess amount that government needs to find ways to save. And she now says that when people retire, they're looking at about 175,000 people who are eligible for early retirement to sort of exit the system, and then those positions will be frozen. But what was really fascinating was that she really took a punch at her colleagues to say that there are ministers who are not abiding with the regulations of the ministerial handbook to have a tight office. And she says that what happens is these ministers come in, they have inflated and bloated offices, staff earning hundreds of thousands of rands, cumulatively. And then what happens is when these ministers are either removed from cabinet or reshuffled,
those people stay.
Those people stay. And what happens is government departments then have to absorb them. And she says, if you look at case by case, the number seems insignificant. But if you have to count all the people that were absorbed into the system from 1994, that number would be absolutely huge. And then she went on to say that, she's written to these ministers to say, make sure you only have 2 advisors. You cannot have more than 2 advisors. We've known stories where ministers had up to 6 advisors. And then your ministry can only have 10 staff members. We know that that's not been, people don't listen to that advice. And so she says now that she's called on the president to take some action, because obviously she can't take action against her colleagues. It's the president that has to take action. And her job now is to go and intervene directly, send her officials in these departments and say, bring me your organogram, so let's see how many people and how big is your wage bill and whether those jobs are fit for purpose.
I mean, it's this particularly interesting development, of course, if you remember the allegations that swirled around Faith Mutambi when she was in that portfolio, but really, I suppose, walking the talk is what we're seeing from Minister Dlodlo. And
she actually mentioned that you know, now those people that her predecessor left behind, some of them family members, I mean, there's lots of stories about them, they were not given contracts that were linked to the political office, meaning they've now remained in the department, and now they're somewhere in government earning a salary and probably not doing or not qualified to do what they're paid to be doing. And so that's a real concern, and we see it you know, mushroom in other departments, and obviously this is something that the president has to deal with.
All right, so those are the stories you're monitoring: the public service, the Northwest, and indeed the State Capture Commission. Qaanitah Hunter, thank you very much for joining us, for giving us that sense of the lay of the land, as it were. Of course, every Monday we do the Political View as a feature. We look at the major stories dominating headlines, and we do value your comments. So we do want your thoughts on this interview, for example. Send them using the hashtag #FullView. You can also, by the way, if you've missed it or caught the tail end of it, watch this interview. Go to sabcnews.com. You'll also find it on our Facebook page, and you will find us on Twitter. That's this Monday's Political View.